As we move on to our first project, we're going to have to answer a few questions as we create a new document in Illustrator. One of those questions is going to be, what color mode do we want to use for our document? So in the interest of not putting the cart before the horse, let's briefly discuss the available color modes and what exactly they mean. Now, although there's many available color modes out there, including Lab, HSB, RGB, and CMYK, don't worry, I'm not going to kill you with acronyms here, but the ones you'll be working with most often are RGB, which stands for red, green, and blue, and CMYK, which stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Now, I've organized these little swatches in that order. And in your Project 2 folder, you're going to find a file called color.ai. So feel free to open this up and you can follow along if you'd like. Now, the additive color mode is made up of red, green, and blue. And additive color is most often seen in sunlight and even the room you're sitting in right now. The light that is being emitted from the light that is lighting your room is essentially made up of equal portions of red, green, and blue. Now we can have some fun here. If you grab the red circle and you move it on top of the green circle, you're going to notice that the combination of those two in the additive color mode makes yellow. Do you see a connection here? Okay. And if we move the blue circle over here and we overlap green, that's going to make cyan. Well, what's that? Okay, and if I overlap all three, you're going to see that blue and red makes magenta. There's the connection. And then the overlapping of all three makes white. Okay, and that's why it's referred to as the additive color model, because as you add those things together, it produces white light, essentially. I'm just going to go ahead and undo that a second. Now, when we come down here to the subtractive color model, this is the color model used in the printing industry. And it kind of works in reverse of the additive color model. If I take the cyan circle and I overlap it with magenta, you're going to see the combination of cyan magenta makes blue. Look at that correlation. And let's go ahead and position these a little bit like so. And I'll grab the yellow one. When I overlap magenta, yellow and magenta makes red. Look at that. And if I combine all three, you're going to see that the cyan and yellow makes the green color. Now, the combination of all three, in contrast with the additive color mode, instead of making white, actually makes black. Now, you may be wondering, well, if all three of these combined makes black, why do we need a black ink when we're printing? Well, the truth is that we as humans can't make inks that are pure enough. And the reality is that when you combine these three inks in real life, we really get like a muddy brown. And that's why we have to add the black ink to really give us those deep, rich shadows. Now I'm just going to kind of move these back to where they were by undoing. And to give you some examples of things that'll use the additive color mode, any artwork created for the web, right? So web graphics are going to be in the RGB color mode. Video graphics and video itself are in the RGB color mode. Anything on your mobile devices, your phones, your tablets, your iPads are going to be in RGB. And anything displayed on a screen, so your computer, on the web, so on and so forth. Now, the subtractive color model, examples of this are all going to be print-based items, because in the printing world, in order to print what you see, we're essentially combining cyan, magenta, yellow, and black to create photographs and various color combinations for flyers, brochures, signs. You can add posters, you can add coasters, business cards, you name it. Pretty much anything printed is printed using cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So hopefully that makes sense to you, and now you have a better understanding of what the color modes are and why you'd want to use one over the other for various projects. All right, so we're ready to create our first project. And at this stage of the game, it's important to have a target, if you will. Now what I mean is, what are we creating? There may be times when you're just experimenting with Illustrator or with different artwork, and your target may not be important at that point in time. but usually when creating a project, you should know what you're creating. When working with a client, whether that client's a friend, a relative, or a person working for an organization that is hiring you to create this project, it's important to make sure that both you and the client are on the same page regarding what you're creating and the work being performed. Doing so will save you and your client a lot of frustration moving forward, and it helps to avoid scope creep, which is when a client keeps asking for additional work to be performed beyond what was originally agreed to. So our first project is for a sign, and that will be displayed outside along a popular walking path. Now, what I did was sketched out a rough idea of what I wanted the sign to look like. Now, it's not fancy, trust me, this is nothing to write home about or put in a portfolio. It was just a rough sketch that I did on paper to give the client an idea of what I had in mind. And the client liked it and wanted me or us to move forward with it. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and jump back to Illustrator. And within the Start Workspace, as you can see we are in right up here, I'm going to come over here and click on the Create New button. And that's going to bring up the New Document dialog. Now, within this New Document dialog, you're going to see that we have a number of different categories up here, including a recent category, which was a recent document that I created. Now, we're creating a sign. Keep that in mind. And so right off the bat, I know that this is going to be a printed product. All right, so up here at the top, I'm going to click on the Print category. Now, one of the things about creating a print document is that down here, you're going to notice that by default, the unit of measurement is set to points. Now, I don't know about you, but I really don't use points when measuring the size of a document. For text and for stroke weight, that makes a lot of sense. But for the general measurement of my document, that's not very helpful. So I'm just going to click on that and change that to inches. Let's go ahead and give this a name right away. I'm going to call this, let's just call it sign. Now, we can now define the size of our document. And this is one of the things that you want to get clarification on before you're creating it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the width of the sign to 18 inches, and I'm going to set the height to 36 inches. All right. Now, you'll notice immediately when I do that, because of the aspect ratio of the measurements that I entered, it automatically wants to make it a portrait document, which means taller than it is wide. Now, as I think about this, I plugged in those numbers incorrectly, and I really want this to be a landscape document. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the landscape icon, and it'll swap those measurements for me. Now, the number of artboards is basically, how many artboards are going to be in your document. Now, we're doing a single-sided sign, so I only need one artboard, but in some cases, and for certain projects, you may want more than one artboard. Okay. Now, in addition, we need to or can define a bleed value. Now, it's important to understand bleed is a completely print-based term that you're only going to hear when dealing with print-based products. And bleed is whenever a document, the contents of the document extend all the way to the edge of the page. This is important because most printing presses and output devices cannot print the ink to the edge of the paper. And therefore, in order to achieve the desired result, we need to extend the content past the edge of the paper. And then once the document is printed or output, it's going to be trimmed to create that appearance. Now, this is a fairly big sign. Standard bleed value in the printing industry is typically 1/8 of an inch or 0.125. Because I'm creating a big sign such as this, I'm going to give it a little bit more bleed. And within this bleed area, you'll notice we have this link button enabled. And I'm just going to increase the value till it says 0.5 inches. And because this link button is enabled, they're all going to change together as a unit. Now, as you come down here, if you open up this category called Advanced Options, it's just important to go over this because when you create a print-based document, one of the properties that you're going to see is that the color mode is automatically set to CMYK. We learned about this in the color video. The raster effect setting is set to 300 pixels per inch. Now in the printing world, 300 pixels per inch is considered high resolution. And what raster effects means is that when we create certain appearances in Illustrator, when it gets output, those appearances likely will get rasterized. And when it does get rasterized or pixelated, we want it to rasterize at a high resolution so it looks nice and smooth. And then we're just going to go ahead and leave the preview mode at its default. So when I click the Create button, you're going to see that we now have a new document. If you'd like, you can press Command-0 or Control-0 on your keyboard, and you'll see that it fits the artboard to your window so that you can see the entire piece. Good job, guys. We're off to a good start. We have our document for our sign created. Why don't you go ahead and save this, and we'll move on to the next video. Now that we have the document created, I realized that the size for the sign is different from what I originally thought. Trust me when I say this happens a lot, okay? The good news is that it's really easy to change even after you've created the document. So let me show you a few techniques that you can use to make that change. Now, one of the mistakes that a lot of people make, and rightly so, because in most programs you can come up here to the File menu and choose Document Setup. Now when you do, you're going to look at this and you're going to be hunting through here and you're going to switch to the different categories and you're going to be like, well, I can't change the size of the document in here. I can adjust the bleed, but I can't really change the size. And you'd be correct. And Illustrator is kind of funny that way. But what you will see is that there's an Edit Artboards button. And if you look over here in the Properties panel, you're also going to see that Edit Artboards button right there. So if I click that button, essentially what it's going to do is it's going to activate the Artboards tool. And now I can actually drag any handle and I can resize this to whatever size I want. Now it'd be great if we were just creating something that was a visual size, but we're not. We have certain requirements for our project. And if you look over here in the Properties panel, you're going to see that it's showing us the X and Y coordinate of the artboard, as well as the width and height. And we want to change the size to 24 by 18, and that will adjust the size accordingly. Now, one other tip that's really useful, in my opinion, is another way that you could quickly adjust the artboard, because sometimes if you start drawing and you decide that you want to change the size to a random size, what you could do is grab the rectangle tool and just kind of click and drag and say, okay, that's about what size I want my artboard to be. Then what you can do is by selecting the artboard tool, you can just double click on that object and it'll change the size of the artboard to that selected object. And you'll still see that that rectangle still exists on there, but that's not exactly what we want to do in this case. So I'm just going to go to Edit, Undo, and then I'll do an Edit, Undo again to remove the rectangle. So if I press Command-0, that'll fit my new sized artboard to my window, and now my sign is the correct size, and I can begin putting content on here. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is draw the background color for my project. I want to use a nice orange color to do this, but to make my life easier, I'm going to create the swatches that I need right away for my document to make it easier to apply and adjust those colors later on. Now the first thing I'm going to do is come over here and grab my rectangle tool. And the job of this tool, as you might imagine, is to draw rectangles. Now what I'm going to do is with my cursor, I'm going to come up here to where my bleed guides intersect. And I'm going to click and drag all the way down to the lower right corner of my page. Now what you're going to notice when you do this is that the default behavior of Illustrator, and don't worry if yours looks different than mine, because if you've been playing around with Illustrator, it's likely that it will look different. But the default behavior of the rectangle tool when you first install Illustrator is that it's going to fill the rectangle with white, and it's going to give the stroke of the rectangle a black stroke. So think of the stroke as, say, the border of the rectangle. If I zoom in here, you're going to notice that there is, in fact, a black border there. and it is in fact filled with white. Now we're certainly going to change that, but before we do, let's go ahead and add the colors that we need for our document. Now here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to come up here and click on my selection tool, and then just click out here to deselect that rectangle. Now, if you come over here in the Properties panel, we currently don't have the ability to create our colors, and that's one of the limitations of the Properties panel because it basically wants you to have an object selected. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up here and go to the Window menu, and we're going to choose Swatches to open up our Swatches panel. And I'll open this up a little bit so I can see everything. And I'm going to start by coming up here to the panel menu and choosing New Swatch. And in the New Swatch dialog, we can maybe go ahead and call this color. We can name this later on. For now, let's just change the values to 94, 63, 57, and 53. And maybe we'll give this a name of, say, like dark blue. Looks kind of darkish bluish. That looks pretty good. And we're not using Creative Cloud libraries right now, so I'm going to uncheck that checkbox. And then we'll go ahead and click OK. And you'll notice that that added a new swatch up here. Okay. Now to keep things organized, you can go ahead and drag this down and just kind of like move it down if you want at the end. And let's go ahead and create another one. So create a new one. I'm going to make the value of this 58, 23, 27, and 13. And we'll maybe call this one light blue. Now, I also want to point out that I'm leaving the global checkbox enabled. And that's really important because what that's going to allow us to do is it's going to create a connection to the swatch and any object in which I apply that swatch. So if I ever update the swatch later on, all of the elements with that swatch applied are also going to update. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Right? Let's go ahead and add another one. This one, the value is going to be 28, 63, 80, and 14. Maybe we'll call this Burnt Sienna. Click OK. Let's add another one. The values for this one is going to be 1, 58, 79, and 0. And maybe I'll just call this one Good Old Fashioned Orange. Let's go ahead and create another one. This one is going to be 3, 38, 81, and 0. And maybe this one will be, say, bright orange. And then finally, we're going to do one more. And the values for this is going to be 11, 0, 76, and 0. And maybe we'll just give that one a name of yellow. Very good. Now, what we can also do to just kind of stay organized is you'll notice I can click on these swatches to select them. So I'm going to click on the dark blue swatch and shift click on the yellow swatch to select them all. And then I'm going to click on this folder icon at the bottom to move them into their own color group. So I'm going to call this group Sign Colors, click OK, and now you can see these are all organized into their own folder. If you want, you can click on the folder for these really bright colors up here and just click the trash can to delete them. I might even do the same thing. And we'll go ahead and leave those shades there. But now we have colors that we can use. So using our selection tool, if we click on that rectangle again, you can notice that you could click on the stroke color to bring it to the front or the fill color to bring it to the front. And whichever one's in the front is the property that will be affected when you apply a color. So if I come over here and click on the orange color, it's going to apply that color to the fill. Now I'm going to click on the stroke color to make it active, and I can either click on this icon down here or this icon up here to set the stroke to none and remove the stroke from the object. The next thing I'd like to draw for our sign project is the mountains in the background of the design. Now we could take a number of different approaches to this. I personally tend to build my designs off of standard shapes for objects and refine them as necessary. So we're going to use the rectangle tool in Illustrator to draw our mountains. Let me show you this approach. Now, I'm picking up where we left off in the last video. And just as a reminder, remember we created a print document. So if you look up here in the tab for the document, it's telling us that this document is currently in CMYK mode. If you ever wanted to change that, you can go to the File menu under Document Color Mode and choose another one if you wish. And along similar lines, if you wanted to change the document raster effects settings, you can come up here to the Effect menu and choose Document Raster Effects Settings and change them to whatever you wish. So drawing the mountains is a pretty simple process. I'm going to move the swatches over here. Let's go ahead and dock them. And I'm going to grab my rectangle tool, and I want the mountains to be like a light blue. So to kind of prepare everything, with the rectangle tool selected, I'm going to come over here to the Appearance section of the Properties panel, and I'm going to click on the Fill indicator. And if you click on the Swatches button, I can choose this light blue that we've defined in a previous video. That looks pretty good. And so I'll just click on the Fill indicator to close that, and now I can click and drag to draw my rectangle. Now I truly want to draw a square, so as I'm dragging the mouse, I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and that's going to constrain the proportions to be a perfect square. So I'm going to go ahead and let go of the mouse, and there we have our square the way we want it to appear. Now, I know what you're thinking. A mountain isn't exactly square like this. Well, it sort of is, but we need to rotate the square before it's going to start to look the way we want it to. So using my selection tool, I'm just going to hover over the corner of this object, and if I click and drag, I can start to rotate this. If I hold down the Shift key as I'm rotating, it'll snap it to 45-degree increments. So I'm going to go ahead and snap this to be a perfect rhombus, or a diamond, if you will. And I want to make this a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to position this down here. And then I'll hold down the Shift key and grab one of these handles, and I can make this shape even bigger. So I'm just going to move this over here, and you can use your judgment, guys. You don't have to make yours look exactly like mine. But I think that looks pretty good. That kind of gives me an idea of what my mountain is going to look like. Now, in addition, what we're going to do here is I don't want it to have a perfectly pointy peak. I'd like it to be rounded. Now, most of the shapes you draw in Illustrator are actually live shapes by default. You're going to notice that in every corner of this shape, we have what's called a corner widget. And when you hover your cursor over that widget, it's going to give you the ability to click and drag on it. And as you drag, you're going to see that you can round the corners of that shape. And that really looks pretty good. Now, in the event that you only wanted to round, say, one of the corners, let's go ahead and undo that. What you can do is switch over to your direct selection tool. And if you click on only that anchor point, you're going to see that you have a widget only for that particular corner. So I can click on that and drag, and now I'm only going to round that corner of the shape. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if I switch back to my selection tool, I am still able to adjust those corners for all of them if I wish. But I only wanted to round the top one, so that's pretty good. Now I'm going to make a copy of this. So if I hold down the Option or Alt key and I drag this, I can make a copy of this mountain. And maybe I want this one to be a little bit bigger. So once again, I'll hold down Shift, and as I drag one of the corners, I can make this mountain a little bit bigger. So I'll just reposition that, and that is looking pretty good to me. I'm liking how that's looking. Now, what I want to do at this point is I want to create kind of a road going through the middle. All right. And the way that I'm going to do that is using my pencil tool. So if you come over here, you may be seeing your shaper tool right now, but if you click and hold on it, you're going to see that we have a pencil tool in there. And so I'm going to choose that pencil tool. And the way that the pencil tool works is utilizing just kind of a free form drawing with your mouse. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the fill color to black so I can see what I'm doing here. And using my pencil tool, I'm going to try to get it, right in the division or the valley between these mountains. And I'm basically going to click and drag to draw a path that I want to create here. Now, if you don't like what you did, that's totally fine. Just go ahead and undo that, and you can just redraw it again. So I'm just going to kind of try to create kind of a nice squiggly line here that's going to represent the path going through the mountains. And what I'll do is I'll come over here to the stroke, click on the stroke color, and make that black just so I can see what I'm doing. Now, I know what you're thinking. We just have kind of a straight line here, and that looks okay, but I want it to more resemble a path, right? So like kind of have perspective in there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and grab my width tool. So I'm going to select that width tool, and I'm going to click on the very end of the path down here, and I'm going to drag perpendicular to it. And what that's going to do is it's going to make the point of the path wider down here, and it's going to keep it thin up here. And that's essentially what the width tool does. So when you have a stroke applied to an object, it's basically going to make it wider at one point and leave it thinner at another. Now, if we come back up to our pencil tool, if you click and hold on it, you're going to see that there's another tool underneath there called the smooth tool. And if you double click on the smooth tool, you have the ability to adjust the fidelity. So I'm going to drag this a little bit more towards the smooth side, and I'm going to click OK. And what this allows me to do is that if I retrace over this path roughly, it's going to smooth it out and make it a lot nicer. And you could do this more than once. You just kind of drag to smooth that out. And that's kind of giving me the rough idea of what I want my mountains and the path between the mountains to look like. All right, so we have a few elements in place, and now we're going to modify them to achieve the visual appearance that we're after. For this design, I want the path in the middle to extend out into the foreground, and we'll need to remove the pointy bottoms of those mountains as well. We'll use a couple of new tools to do that. So I'm going to start by combining those two mountain shapes into one, because I think it'll make it easier to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and use my selection tool, and I'm going to click on the first mountain and then shift click on the second mountain. Now, one of the tools we have at our disposal is something called the Pathfinder panel. Now, I happen to have that docked over here in my panel dock, but you can also access it by going to the window menu and choosing Pathfinder. Now, with those two objects selected, I'm going to click on this first icon here, which is Unite. And when I click on that, what you're going to see is that it merges these two items together. These are basically now one item. Let me move this over so you can see. You see there's no more overlapping lines. They're now one complete unit. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that by pressing Command or Control Z. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to punch this shape through that grouped shape. Now, in order to do that, I need to do something called expanding it. And so right now this is a stroke, and I need it to be a filled object. So with this shape selected, I'm going to go to the Object menu, and I'm going to choose Expand Appearance. And when I do that, you're going to notice that the stroke in the middle disappears. And if I switch over to my Direct Selection tool, you'll now be able to see all of the anchor points that make up that path. Now I'm going to go back to my Selection tool, and I'm going to select the path, and then I'm going to shift click on the mountains. Now, similar to the Pathfinder panel, over here in our Tools panel, we have this guy here, which is called the Shape Builder. And I like to think of the Shape Builder as the Pathfinder in a tool. That's probably the best way to describe it, because it does the same thing, but I would argue a little more intuitively. Now, when you hover over this, you're going to see that different areas are highlighted in a unique way. And if I were to simply, for example, down here where these overlap, if I click and drag across those two items, it's going to merge them together. Now, I'm going to undo that, because what happens is, because I clicked on this first and then dragged to that, it changed it to black. So if I click over here and drag it to this, the same thing still happens. Not a big deal, because we're going to be changing these colors in a little bit. Now, if you hold down your Option or Alt key, this will remove items. So I'm going to hold down the Option or Alt key. I'm going to click on this item, and then I'm going to do the same thing here to punch a hole through that shape. How cool is that? And now that we're finished, we can come over here to the Appearance panel and change the fill color back to that light blue color that it was. Now you might have to switch over to the Selection tool in order to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, select the shape, and then we can make this a light blue. There we go. So now you can see that that path is kind of cut out of those two shapes, and I think that's looking pretty good. Now what I really want to do, however, is I need to get rid of these pointy items down here. And there's a couple ways we can do that. The way that I'm going to do it, that's probably the most intuitive, is using the eraser tool. And that is this guy right up here. The eraser tool, if you click on it, its job is to erase elements of this design. Now, you could double click on the eraser tool and that'll allow you to change the size of it. But what exactly is 10 points? You know, it's really hard for us to understand that. So I'm just going to cancel out of that. And the way that I like to change the size of the eraser tool is using the left and right bracket key on your keyboard. And those are the two keys to the right of the letter P. So if I tap the right bracket key, I can make this brush bigger. Now, what this allows me to do, because I have this selected already, is as I scrub across this, it looks like I'm erasing everything. But when I let go, you'll see that I'm only erasing the shape overall. So here's what I'm going to try to do. What I'm trying to do is create kind of like a smooth transition here. So I'm going to just erase some of this over here. Okay. And then what I'm going to try to do, and you might need to make your brush smaller, is I'm going to try to follow this contour and just create something like that. You know, something where it just kind of like blends back into the overall shape. I'm going to do the same thing down here, maybe kind of come from this point here and just try to create kind of a nice smooth transition. Not too bad. And so, you know, at this point, what you may need to do is just do some touch up. And if you don't like what you do, undo it and try it again, right? That's all there is to it. So I'm just going to kind of try to create a nice smooth transition over here so that I don't have any of the background remaining. Over here, I think I need to come in a little bit more. Maybe I'll make my brush a little bit smaller. And I'm going to try to come over here and maybe round this like so. And again, some of this is just trial and error, you know, so you could play around with it and experiment. Now, if you got rid of too much, the other option you have is we can switch over to the blob brush tool. And the blob brush tool kind of does the opposite of the eraser. If you click and hold on the paintbrush tool, you'll see that you have the blob brush tool. And my current fill color is the blue. So what's going to happen, and it uses the same brush tip as the eraser. So if I tap the right bracket key, I can make this a little bit bigger. You'll make this a little bit easier to work with. And instead of erasing items, the blob brush adds. So what I'm going to do, I think I went up a little too far here. So I'm going to try to add some color back in. See how that works? I'm just adding to what's already there. And I'm just trying to extend this down a little bit. I don't like that. Let's try that again. And just trying to kind of shape this into kind of a nice curve. And that's looking pretty good. I mean, we may want to have to play around with that a little bit later. But I think overall, you know, that's kind of the overall look that I'm going for. And now that we've done that, we can kind of move on. We may want to smooth these paths out a little bit, and we can do that in a future video. But for now, I think that looks pretty good. Our project is taking shape, but there's some cleanup we need to do, which involves smoothing paths, removing some anchor points, and even adding some anchor points. These tasks are honestly everyday life when working in Illustrator to get the desired result. So let's see how it's done in our project. Now, looking at our project, I like how things are coming along, but one of the things I'm noticing is that the paths down here and maybe around here are just kind of choppy. They're not as smooth as I'd like them to be. And there's a couple of ways to approach this, but the way that I like to fix that is using the smooth tool in Illustrator. And so I'm going to start by selecting my path with the direct selection tool. And that allows me to see all of the anchor points that make up these paths. And keep in mind, that's how paths are created. Anchor points connecting together to create the overall path. And because we used the blob brush tool and the eraser tool, the result that we got was, not perfect, not what we're looking for. So over here in my tools panel, I'm going to, right now I'm seeing the pencil tool. Again, you might be seeing the shaper tool, but I'm going to grab the smooth tool. And once again, if we double click on this, there's not a whole lot of options here, but the fidelity slider allows me to control how accurate or how smooth the resulting path is going to be. And so again, I kind of stick to this setting here, but feel free to experiment on your own to kind of figure out, which one works best for you. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then all I'm going to do is kind of retrace over this path. And you'll see that as I do, you could go more than once. As I do this, the path just kind of keeps getting smoother and smoother. And you'll also notice that the number of anchor points that are used gets reduced. And that's also helpful as well. So I'm just going to try to smooth out these paths. But that's looking pretty good. Then I'm going to come around here and see what I can do here. Yeah, that's looking better, I think. And again, you can kind of keep on trying. The more you do it, the smoother it gets typically. And yeah, that looks pretty good. That looks better than what it did. There we go. And then over here, even though this is extending past the bleed, it's technically not needed, and it's not going to hurt anything to be extended over there. But I would like to clean it up a little bit. So I'm going to zoom in. And to do that, you can use the keyboard shortcuts on your keyboard. You can use Command or Control plus to zoom in. You can use Command or Control minus to zoom out. Now you may notice it just kind of zooms in on the center of the element, and I really want to zoom in over here. So that's where the zoom tool is more effective, because using the zoom tool, I can click where I want to zoom in, and it's going to zoom in to that area. Now, if you're not getting the dynamic zoom that I'm getting, it's because your GPU is not compatible with Illustrator. And so for you, what I'll do is I'll click on the rocket ship here and disable it for a second. If you're not getting that behavior, you're going to get the marquee behavior. And that is that when you click and drag around an area, it'll zoom in on that area. So whatever you prefer and whatever your computer's set up for is what you're going to experience. Now, to get rid of these items, one of the things that people will often do is they'll grab the direct selection tool, click on an anchor point, and hit the delete key. Now, the problem with that method is that you've now broken the path. It's now no longer a closed path. It's now an open path that has a beginning and an end. And so I'm going to undo that because that's not exactly what I want. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the pen tool. That's this guy right here. And when you hover over a path using the pen tool, you're going to see it switches to the add anchor point tool. You can see a little plus sign next to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an anchor point right here where the path intersects the bleed. And then when you hover over an existing anchor point, you get the minus sign or the remove anchor point tool. And when I click, it's going to remove that item. So I'm going to zoom out by pressing Command or Control 0. I'm going to zoom in over here. And I'm going to do pretty much the same thing. Now what I'll do is I'll add an anchor point where the path intersects the bleed up here at the top and at the bottom. And now I can just click on these anchor points to remove them to clean up the overall appearance of this path. So I think I deselected it. Let's go back to the direct selection tool and select that, and we'll try that again. So hover over it, remove it. There we go. Sometimes you have to try it again. And if you're getting this behavior here, you know, where you have kind of like a smooth area, you can hold down the Alt or Option key as you click on that anchor point, and that'll convert it to what's called a corner point and make it a straight path. So that's looking a lot better. Now let's grab our rectangle tool, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to click and drag from the right side over here all the way down to the lower left corner, and I'm going to fill that with that dark color that we have. And using my selection tool, I'm just going to grab this top handle and I'm going to extend it up to where that path begins. Okay. Now I want this color to be behind the mountains. So what you can do is click on the mountains, go to your object menu and choose Arrange, Bring to Front. And that'll bring the mountains in front of that background shape. Now it's looking pretty good, but we have a little bit of area back here where it's sticking out, and that I definitely don't want. So I'm going to take the easy approach. I'm going to select this shape. I'm going to grab the eraser tool, and I'm just going to erase this area where it overlaps the mountains. And I really don't care what it looks like behind the mountains. I'm really just concerned with what it looks like overall in the overall design of the project. And that's looking pretty good. I think we all did a good job. In my initial sketch, I was thinking that I'd put a bird in one of the corners of the sign. But thinking that people are going to be looking at this sign from a distance, I don't want anything with too much detail. So I'm thinking that maybe the silhouette of a bird, and I'm thinking of like a blue heron, might look really good on the sign. So let's go ahead and create that now. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in down here in the lower left corner. I showed you how to use the zoom tool earlier, and a little tip is that if you hold down Command Spacebar on Mac or Control Spacebar on Windows, it'll temporarily access that zoom tool so you can click and drag and zoom in on that sign. And then to move the document around once you're zoomed in, you can use the hand tool, or you can simply hold down the spacebar and drag to reposition the document where you want it to go. Now, I'm going to start by drawing the head of the bird. And to do that, I'm going to use the ellipse tool to create an oval. So if you click and hold on the rectangle tool, grab the ellipse tool. I'm just going to go ahead and click and drag to draw an oval, maybe something about like this. And again, this is trial and error, guys. When I do this, you really have to experiment, play around, and come up with something that you really like. I'm going to hover over the corner. Actually, I'm going to switch to my selection tool, hover over the corner, and I'm just going to rotate it down a little bit. Let's try that again. Click on that, rotate, there we go. And just a slight angle, this is, the bird's head, maybe looking down a little bit, not too much. And then what I'll do is I want to draw the beak. Okay, now to do that, I'm thinking that I'll use the line tool. So if I grab this line segment tool, I'm going to go ahead and click over here on the right side, and then I'm going to drag to the right on just a slight downward slope, maybe something like that. And I'm going to set the stroke color to that light blue that we created. And then I'm going to increase the stroke weight. So if you click on the word stroke, it'll bring up the stroke panel. And I'm going to increase the weight to maybe 5 points. And then I'm going to change the cap to a rounded cap. And what that's doing is basically rounding the tip of that line. Now it needs to be tapered, so I'm going to grab the width tool, and I'm going to click on this end of the path, and I'm going to drag up to vary the width of that path. And my idea is that's going to create the beak for the bird. Not looking too bad. Now, obviously, the bird's head is not perfectly shaped, okay? So that's where the direct selection tool can really be helpful. I'm going to click on that oval, and I'm going to click on this anchor point to select it. And I'm going to drag up to the left a little bit to distort the shape of this oval to try to mimic the shape of a bird's head. I'm going to do the same thing down here. Click and drag over, maybe making it a little wider on this side and kind of, replicating or trying to create the overall shape of the bird's head. And if you want, over here you see this handle. You can click on that handle and drag down, and that'll allow you to distort, the back of that oval. So I think that's looking okay. Now let's go ahead and create the bird's neck. So I'm going to move this up a little bit, maybe zoom out a touch. And a heron has kind of a curved neck, And again, an easy way to draw that is using my pencil tool. So it might take a time or two, but I'm just going to kind of click up here, and I'm going to just kind of like drag to create kind of a curve like this. I don't know, maybe I'll undo that. Maybe I want a little bit more of a curve. Maybe something like that. And then what I'll do, again, using my width tool, I'm going to go ahead and make this wide. All right, now it needs a stroke. That's why it doesn't want to allow me to do this. So if I click on the stroke color, I'm going to make that blue as well. And then down here, I'm going to go ahead and click with that width tool, drag across, and that's going to make it wider down here. Okay. Now what I'm also going to do is I'm going to make it wider up here. Ideally not quite as wide, but maybe something like that. I'm going to zoom out and we can kind of see what we have. That might be a little too wide. Let's narrow that a little bit. Okay. And if we wanted to, we can go to the stroke panel and put that rounded cap on there as well. That might help it to blend in up here a little bit later. So using my selection tool, I'm going to zoom in pretty far. And what I'm trying to do here is I want to move this over so that it kind of comes off of the back of the head. I was kind of looking at some photos, and I encourage you guys to do the same thing when you're doing this type of work. And the idea is that I just want it to kind of be a little, pretty seamless over here on the right. It might help right now if you go to your view menu, uncheck smart guides, because Illustrator's trying to be smart right now, and it's not as smart as it thinks sometimes. So I don't know. I think that looks pretty good. Let's zoom out and take a look at what we have. We can always fine tune it a little bit later. Also, the heron has a little kind of tuft that comes off of the back of its head. So using that pencil tool again, make sure that nothing's selected. Using that pencil tool, I think what I'll do is just kind of draw a little something like that. And I think I'll use the width tool again to make it a little wider up at the top to kind of create that little tuft that's coming off. And we might need to just reposition this a little bit to get it to line up. I don't know. I think that's okay. We can always refine it more later on. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to group these items together to make it easier to work with. So I'm going to select the tuft, shift click on the head, shift click on the beak, and shift click on the neck. And I'm going to choose object group. And now when I click on this, it'll move as a unit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to position this up here, and holding down the shift key, I'm just going to drag to enlarge this to kind of make it, fit within there. Now, one of the things you might have noticed, I'm going to undo that a little bit, take it back to where it was. One of the things you might notice is that it got messed up a little bit because what was happening is when I scaled it, the stroke was not scaling. And that's where we want to switch over to the scale tool. If you double click on the scale tool, it'll bring up a dialog box that gives us the ability to also scale the strokes and effects. And that's really important. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now if I move my cursor down here, I'm just going to click and drag while holding the shift key to scale this object up. And now you can see all those strokes have scaled proportionately along with it. Now I'm just going to reposition this, move this down here, and I think that looks pretty good. Very few of the projects that you create can be complete without type. For this design, we want to announce to the viewer what the sign is about and what it's promoting. Illustrator has amazing typographic control, allowing you to set professional-looking type for your project. Now I'm going to start here with the project we've been working on, And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on the type tool. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And then it's important to understand that there are actually two different ways that you can create type in Adobe Illustrator. Those two types of type, if you will, are called point type and area type. Now, the first method I'll show you is what's called area type. And area type is created by using your cursor and clicking and dragging to create an area type object. And an area type object is best used for paragraph type, for multiple lines that you want to change the alignment. And what I'll do is I'll just select all of this and change the color to white just so we can see what we're doing here. And if I zoom in a little bit, by default, this is just using lorem ipsum, so don't worry about what it says. But understand that with area type, as you adjust the size of the object, the text is going to reflow within that area. So you can understand why you might want to use this. If you have lengthy text in your project, this is where area type really comes into play. Now, the other type, I'm going to go ahead and delete this, that we can create is called point type. And point type is created with the same tool. The difference is that instead of clicking and dragging, you just basically click. And that creates what's called a point type object. All right. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to type some text in here, and you don't have to type what I type. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this lorem ipsum text, and I'm going to go ahead and type the words welcome to thee, and then I'm just going to put an ellipse at the end. And let me change the color of this so we can see this a little bit better. I'm actually going to use the lighter orange color for this text. I think that'll look pretty good. Now, when you're adjusting text in your document, you want to select it with the type tool. And then over here in your properties panel, you'll notice down here in the character area, we have a lot of choices for what we want to do to our type. So first of all, we can increase the size of our type. So I'm just clicking the up arrow. You can also click on the drop down and choose from a predefined size here. Maybe I'll go with, say, like 36 to start. And then, of course, you can also choose the font. Okay, now I'm going to click on the drop down menu here to see all of the fonts I have available. And I'm going to scroll through here. You can use, honestly, whatever font you want. I'm going to go with a font that I've loaded on my computer, and this is available in your Typekit library. It's called Classico URW, and I'm going to go ahead and choose the bold version of that. And I like this font for its readability. It is technically a sans serif font, which means there's really no serifs on here. But I love this font because it has varying widths to it. You can see the elements get thick and thin throughout, and it just really makes for a nice font for your design. So that looks pretty good. Now, also down here, you'll also notice you have your paragraph alignment. Now, when you change the alignment with point type, it may seem a bit random as to what it's doing, but if you click on this with your selection tool, you will notice that your point type has a small reference point right here. Now, right now I'm aligned to the center, which means this is the center and the text is going to grow left to right. If I click on align left, that dot, if you will, moves over here, and now anything I do when I type, it grows from the left to the right. So it all depends on what you're trying to create, how you're going to align your content. So I think I'll leave mine set to align left. I think that looks pretty good. Now let's create another point type object. We want this to say, welcome to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Now you can replace Chesapeake Bay with a bay that's closer to your area where you live, or any area of your choice. But I'm just going to click, and I'm going to type the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and I'm going to go ahead and highlight this. I'm going to change the color. I'm going to go with that light orange again. And then we definitely want to increase the size of this. Now, I want to show you how we can do that with our keyboard. When you have text selected, you can hold down Shift Command on the Mac or Shift Control on Windows. And if you use the greater than and less than key on your keyboard, you can visually adjust the size of the text and change it to, how you want this to look. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can get a helicopter view of this. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I want this to kind of fill the area. And now I'll switch to my selection tool so that I can reposition this where I want it to appear. I think that looks pretty good. We may want to adjust the size a little bit later. And then my idea was the welcome to thee. I was going to kind of tuck this in over here. Now, one of the principles you're going to encounter as you're working with type is that the larger the type gets, the more disproportionate the space between the characters can tend to look. And this font doesn't do too bad of a job, actually. As I look at this, it looks pretty good. But I'm noticing like a little bit of gappy areas here. And I may want to make an adjustment to that. So I'm going to do that by adjusting the kerning for the type. And the kerning is the space between individual characters within your type. So if I double click to switch to the type tool and I put my cursor there, your kerning is this guy right over here, and you can use the down arrow key to reduce the space between those characters, and you can use the up arrow key to increase the space. Okay? Now, I like to actually use my keyboard shortcut, which is Option or Alt and the left and right arrow key. So as I make this adjustment, you can see that visually I can change that spacing. And then I can just use my right arrow to jump to the next kerning pair or the next pair of characters, and I can just adjust the kerning to my desired amount. And usually the difference between a really good looking headline and one that doesn't look very good is kerning, right? So kerning just kind of makes the characters look like they belong together. So I'm just making some slight adjustments here and just kind of making these characters look like they belong together. So I'll make a couple more adjustments here, and that doesn't look too bad. Now, along with kerning, we also have tracking. Let's get rid of that space there. Now, tracking, as opposed to kerning, is adjusting the space between a range of characters. And that one is this guy right here. And you'll notice that if I increase the value, I'm increasing the space between the range of characters instead of individual kerning pairs. Okay? So this is how you can really get your type to look exactly the way you want it to. I think I'm going to make this a little bit bigger to fit in there. And then we'll just kind of reposition this. And, I may decide later on that I want to move that text, just kind of bring it up here and line it up like that. But, maybe for now, I think I'll just kind of leave it tucked in there. I think that looks pretty good. And maybe we'll just kind of reposition this a little bit. So that's kind of getting started with your type. And now that I use that orange, I think I might actually apply that lighter orange to my background, make it a little less contrasty, but still liking that color scheme. One of the really cool things we can do in Illustrator is set type along a path. So instead of the type being perfectly horizontal, we can put the type on a curved path, or even a straight path if you want. That's what we're going to do next, as we need to create an emblem for the foundation that is sponsoring this sign. Now, while we're on the topic of type, I want to bring up an important concept to consider when working with type, which is readability. When creating your project, you always want to consider your demographic, or who the audience is going to be. Because, for example, an older demographic is going to require larger type than a younger one. And another consideration is viewing distance. For example, our sign. Objects that are being viewed from a distance will need larger text than what you'd see on, say, a flyer or in a magazine. So keep these things in mind. Now I'm going to start over here. We're going to put our emblem over here in this lower right-hand corner. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a bit. And I'm going to grab my ellipse tool. And I'm going to click and drag while holding the shift key. And I'm going to create an emblem. I think I'll go with maybe about this big. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the fill to none. And I'm going to change my stroke color to paper. And if you click on the word stroke, I think what I'll do is maybe increase the weight to 2 points. We'll start with that and then we can change it if we want. Now with your selection tool, I'm going to click on this and we'll go ahead and choose Edit Copy. And then I'm going to choose Edit Paste in Front to copy another ellipse and paste it right on top of the existing one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Shift key and drag one of these handles. And then I'm also going to add the Alt or Option key to scale it from the middle. And when I get right about here, I think that's going to be pretty good. Now note when I did that, the stroke weight scaled as well. So I'm going to increase that back up to 2 points. Now we need one more of those circles, okay? And so what I'll do is I'll copy this inner circle, and then we'll do a paste in front again. And let's scale this up from the middle just a little bit, maybe something like that. Now I'm not worried about the stroke weight right now, and that's because when we add type to it, the stroke is going to disappear. Now, to set type on a path, we're going to come up here and click on our type tool. Then we're going to click and hold on it and choose type on a path tool. Now, instinctively, when people want to set type on a circular path, they tend to want to click up here at the very top. I'm going to encourage you not to do that. We're actually going to click down here at the very bottom. And I'm going to click on that, and we're going to type the word Chesapeake Bay. Now I'm going to select all that type, so we can just kind of like click and drag. Oops. We're just going to go ahead and click and drag to select that. I'm going to change the color to paper, or white, sorry. And then over here in the alignment, I'm going to click on center. And that's why I tell people to click on the bottom of the circle, because when you align it to the center, it snaps right to the top of the path. Really, really cool. Now that text is a little too big. Let's go ahead and reduce that. So I'm going to decrease the size, and I'm still using the Classico URL font. And I'm just going to decrease that to make it kind of fit within that area, as nicely as I can. That doesn't look too bad. And then I'll switch to my selection tool so I can get a better look at this, and that doesn't look too bad. Now I also want to put some text on the bottom. So what I'll do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to choose Edit Copy. Then I'll choose Edit Paste in Front. And if you click on this little bar, this is the middle bar that allows me to click on it and drag it, and I can spin it on the path. And once I've spun it upside down, I'm going to drag across the path. And sometimes you have to practice once or twice to get it right. And that way I'm going to have the text aligning to the bottom of the circle. Now if I double click, it'll switch to the type tool. Then I can select all the text, and we're going to type Watershed Foundation. Okay. Now the problem we run into right now is that the text on the top of the circle is aligning to the baseline of the text, but it's on the outside of the circle, and now it's on the inside of the circle. So that creates a little bit of a conundrum, but one that we can fix fairly easily. So let's select that text. Just going to kind of click and drag to select it all. And one of the limitations of the Properties panel is that it doesn't show you everything you need. But if you click on this little hamburger button down here, it'll open up the rest of the options. And the one that I want to use is right here, which is called Baseline Shift. And as its name implies, it allows me to shift the type relative to the baseline of the text. So I'm going to click the down arrow key as many times as I need to, and what I'm trying to do is I want to get the ascender of the text to basically align on the path. And that way, it's essentially lining up in the same way as it is on the top. Now, as I look at this, I'm thinking maybe the point size is a little too big, so let's reduce that point size a little bit more. And then you may need to adjust that baseline shift because we changed the value. There we go. And I set that to 20 points. So if I click off of this, We can look at that, and I think I kind of like that because we want Chesapeake Bay to be a little bit larger, and then Watershed Foundation is underneath. Now what I'm going to do is I want to basically, we have 4 separate elements there, and maybe as I look at this, let's click on the 2 stroked paths, and let's reduce that to 1 point. I think that looks a little bit better. And then what we could do is I want to group all of these together. Now here's a technique that I use a lot. I'm actually going to click out here. I'm going to click and drag across those elements. And by dragging across them, it's going to select all of them. Now if I zoom out, one of the things you'll notice too though is that I also inadvertently selected this background element. So if I shift click on the background element, it'll deselect that element. And I might have even gotten this one too, so I'm going to click on that. You can see what's happening. I still have some other elements selected. So I'm going to try that again. We're just going to kind of drag across that. And then let's go ahead and shift click to deselect that. I want to deselect that. There we go. And now we only have the logo selected. So now we can go to the object menu and choose group. And now those elements are grouped together as one unit. That's looking pretty good. Good job, guys. A gradient is a transition from one color to another across an object. As a matter of fact, a gradient can transition between several colors if you so desire. I'd like to add some depth to the mountains on this sign, and we'll do that using a gradient. So to do this, I'm going to select the mountains with my selection tool. And I'm going to open up my gradient panel. Now you'll notice that you do in fact have your fill over here, but because I don't have a swatch created, I can't really add it. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the window menu, and I'm going to choose gradient. And that's going to open up my gradient panel right over here. I'm just going to leave this floating to make it a bit easier for us to see. Now within the gradient panel, in the type drop-down menu, we can choose a radial gradient, which is going to be a gradient that transitions from the center outward, or we can apply a linear gradient, which is a gradient that transitions from one point to the other across a horizontal line. Now, when you apply a gradient, by default, it just simply adds a black and white transition. And what I want to do is certainly change those colors. But one of the other things I want to do is I want to rotate that gradient as well. Now, we can do this using the gradient tool, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes, but we can also do it right here by changing the angle. And if you click on the drop-down menu and choose -90, that's going to create a transition, in this case, from light to dark, light being at the top and dark being at the bottom. Now, I certainly don't want my gradient to be white to black. That doesn't look like a very realistic mountain. And so what I'm going to do, down here, this is your gradient slider, okay? And the gradient slider is made up of 1, 2 gradient stops. Now, to change the color of the stop, you can simply double-click on the stop, and it'll bring up another window that allows you to either change the existing color. You can even come up here and choose between the RGB or CMYK sliders. So I can just start changing the color, and that's going to start changing the overall color of the gradient. But I want to be more specific, so I'm going to click on my swatches button, and I'm going to choose the light blue swatch that we added earlier. And if you just click to get out of that window, you're going to notice that it now transitions from white to that blue color. And that's what's represented down here in your gradient slider as well. Now, in addition to changing the color, if you so desire, you can also double click on the stop, and you can also reduce the opacity. And when I do that, you're going to start seeing through the object, which is not what I want to do in this example. However, there are some cases where that might make sense. So I'm going to increase that opacity back up to 100. And now I'll go ahead and dock my gradient panel for now. And then if I really want to refine this transition, because right now it's just going from 0 to 100 and kind of splitting the difference halfway. As a matter of fact, if I go back to the gradient panel, This guy here is the transition point. So I can drag this to the left so that I see less white and more blue, or I can drag it to the right where I'll see more white and less blue. So however you want to adjust that, you could certainly do that. Now the other way we can do this is by clicking on the gradient tool. And when you do that, it displays what's called the gradient annotator. And the gradient annotator is kind of a representation of what we see in the gradient panel, although it's showing it to you applied to the object. So you can see down here is your blue color stop, up here is the white color stop, and here's your transition point. So you can certainly make an adjustment there. And then you can also hover, let's do it down here, hover over the corner, and we can rotate this if we want to as well. So we can make the gradient go on an angle if we wish. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to put that back to straight up and down. And then you can also drag the endpoints to determine where the gradient starts and finishes. So for example, I can drag this up a bit so that I end up with more blue showing up in there and less white. And so I kind of like how that's looking. You know, we're getting a little bit of a transition. And if I want to, I can even play around with the transition point to get a little bit more white and a little less blue. So that's how you apply a gradient to an object in Illustrator to get the overall look and feel that you want in your design. Layers provide a level of control that make it easier to work in Illustrator while also allowing you to hide and show elements on an as-needed basis. Let's use the Layers panel to organize the content in this document and provide you with some control while you're working. Now I'm going to open up the Layers panel, which is currently located right over here next to my Properties panel. And if you don't see that, just go to your Window menu and choose Layers to display it. Now, every Illustrator document has at least one layer. Whether you like it or not, you're always working on at least one layer. And if you open up this layer by clicking on this triangle here, you're going to notice that every single object that you've created so far is displayed in that Layers panel. Now, you may be familiar with the concept of the stacking order of objects in a document. You know, bring to front, send to back. Well, the Layers panel is a visual look at the stacking order of the objects in your document, where the topmost objects are frontmost in your document. Now, one of the great things about Layers is that it allows me to organize my content. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to collapse this. And by default, the default layer in Illustrator is called Layer 1. Well, I'm going to double click on that, and I'm going to call this Background. All right. Now, keep in mind, everything is on that layer right now, but we're going to divvy things up a little bit. So I'm going to create another layer. So down here at the bottom, I'm going to click on the New Layer button, and it creates a new layer called Layer 2. I'm going to double click on it, and let's call this one Mountains and Water. Now, I'm going to click on the mountains, and you can see that the mountains are kind of outlined in blue, and that's because the background layer is blue. And you can see way over here, there's a little square indicating that the selected object is on that layer. If you click on that square and drag it up to the Mountains and Water layer, you've now moved that object to that layer. And you'll notice that now it has a red outline on it. Let's click on the Water down here, and let's move that up to the Mountains and Water layer as well. Now you'll notice what happened is that the water came in front of the mountains, and that's just because when we did that, we adjusted the stacking order. What we can do is we can click on this path, just drag it down, and that'll change the stacking order back to where it was. Even though these items are called path by default, you can rename those items. It's not necessary to rename everything, but it sure does make life easier as you start working in the Layers panel. Now, if you double click on this empty area over here, it's going to display your layer options where you can name it, you can choose whether it's showing or whether it's going to print, whether it previews, and you can also change the color if you wish. The color never appears in your final product. It'll only show up while you're working in Illustrator. Go ahead and click OK. Now I'm going to create another layer. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is that the mountains and water layer is now covering up some of the things on the background layer. So if you click on this visibility icon, you can just hide the layer. Let's go ahead and create another layer. And I'm going to call this one Artwork. And I'm going to select the heron that I created, and I'm going to move that up to the Artwork layer. Let's create another layer. I'm going to call this one Text. And I'm going to select the Welcome to, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Type on a Path group. And I'm going to move all that up to the text layer. And if you turn on all the layers again, you can see that the artwork still looks the same. Nothing has changed, but now everything is organized. And I can hide the text layer, I can hide the artwork, and I can hide the mountains and water, leaving me only with this background. By the way, after the gradient video, I played around with that background and added a radial gradient to it. So feel free to do that if you wish. You can play around with that and create your own design. And a little tip here, if you want to hide all the layers or several layers, you can click and drag to turn them all off and click and drag to turn them all on. Now, the other thing that's really helpful with layers is I can lock a layer by clicking on this empty square right here. And now I can't click on the background, which is pretty cool because if you remember when I was trying to select this text emblem, I was selecting these elements in the process. But if I were to lock the artwork layer and the mountains layer, now I can select that without ever having to worry about inadvertently selecting other objects. Layers are very powerful and really help you to stay organized as you're working. I encourage you to use them and take advantage of them as much as possible.